Well, welcome to this panel on the changing role of news media in public diplomacy. And I'm very glad to be introducing, I think, a wonderful group of people who will all be bringing insight to this subject. And I have to think, as a dyslexic, I now have to think carefully. This is my right hand. So on my right, Kate Neeper, who is Director of Strategy and Performance at the USAGM. And Kate is a graduate both of George Washington University and a school in California called University of Southern California, which is very, very nice to see Trojans in the nation's service. So I'm excited about that. Joining us on the screen is Dmitry Khaykin, who's head of distribution for Europe for Deutsche Welle, and then to my left is a Markos Kounalakis, whose affiliations include the Hoover Institution. He is a scholar, former award-winning foreign correspondent, and today, owing to the absence of the governor of California, he is the first gentleman of California, so the first gentleman of the great state of California, which is, I find very exciting, but I guess I've sort of taken on a kind of a Californian identity now.
I'm surprised they let you leave the state.
Yes, that's right. He's the author of Spin Wars and Spy Games, Global Media and Intelligence Gathering, and I think we'll be alluding to that book, which is on the stand outside during his remarks. And finally, on my far left, but not politically, is Sewell Chan, who's formerly a journalist of the Washington Post, the LA Times, New York Times, and is now the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, which those of you who don't know Texas, Texas Tribune has made a tremendous difference to the news landscape in Texas, and has a really interesting business model, which I think will be one of the things we'll be talking about. And so just to get things started, what we'll be talking about today is the role of the media in public diplomacy. And the media has always been an important part of public diplomacy, both from the value of state-sponsored media, and we've heard a lot about the wonderful things that Voice of America has done, that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty have done in the past. But I think we also need to think about the way, excuse me, the way in which media is also part of democratization. So building free media around the world is a foreign policy priority and is part of the solution to improving the world around us. However, we're also very aware from this conference about the connection between the media and disruption, the way in which media is part of the problem, and I don't have to go through the multiple ways in which we've already talked about this. The final thing that we need to talk about here is media is great, but how do you pay for it? And this is the point at which each of our panelists has a different answer for how media is paid for, and what comes with the deal, what comes with the connection to the guy who is footing the bill. But if I could start off and invite each of our panelists just to talk about how they see this issue of media in public diplomacy from their own point of view. And maybe if I could start off with Markos. Is that okay?
Sure. Thank you. And just to follow up on the last panel, I used to broadcast into the Soviet Union for Radio Sweden International and had a popular rock program on the weekends with a Brit and an Australian. It was called The Saturday Show, and apparently our ratings were pretty good, and I eventually met some of my audience, which was terrific. And also to follow up on Sewell's last line, there is one interesting rock musician. If you ever get a chance to speak with Lenny Kravitz, he's actually he's not boring. His father was a journalist also for NBC, so that brings me back to the journalism of how we look at it. I was really taken by yesterday's panel when Dr. Stradner talked about the ongoing information war. And I think she sort of framed a lot of what we are talking about, which is an understanding that there is, in fact, not just a competition, but in fact, a war going on between these factions. In her sense, she was talking about Russia and its never-ending post-Soviet and into Russian era war against the West. And so during this period, we've also seen just enormous a transition. And that transition has really, in the West, meant the collapse of the business model for news and information services, which means that things become very expensive for these organizations. In many cases, we see news deserts evolving, local journalism disappearing. But in the international sense, it is this question of expense. If there are two things that are very expensive in journalism, and I'm a former publisher myself, I used to publish the Washington Monthly, the two things that are most expensive are, from my perspective, investigative reporting and foreign corresponding. Investigative reporting means you get to spend a lot of money. Since we're in Texas, it's like wildcatting. You sort of you dig a bunch of wells, and if occasionally you strike one, the difference is in Texas you become very rich. In journalism, you get sued. And so... and in
Texas, investigative journalism.
There you go. So there you have it.
Both.
Right.
No.
So that's one part with the problem with the business model. The second is, of course, foreign corresponding, where the cost of a bureau and for at times security, if you're in a conflict zone, et cetera, is enormously expensive. And so I did my research, and as Nick mentioned, I have a book called Spin Wars and Spy Games, and I started with the assumption that there were fewer correspondents in the world. And then the question became, well, what does that mean for our democracy? What does it mean for our informed society? And as I started investigating this work and trying to answer this question, I found out that, in fact, there are more foreign correspondents in the world than there have ever been. The difference is they're not our foreign correspondents. So if you look, and by that I mean those of the West. So if you look around the world, you'll see enormous expense from the Chinese government, from the Russian government to develop bureaus of CGTN, Xinhua, China Daily. RT has established itself in many, many countries. And so then my question changed. What does it mean not only when our foreign correspondents disappear for our democracy, for our informed citizenry, but what does it mean for the world when the information that we're gathering is from these, from our perspective, adversarial, or at least nations that, in Dr. Stradner's perspective, are at war with us? So without belaboring it and telling you, I'm going to jump right to the conclusions, which is from the public diplomacy side. They have an effect on elite influence. They have an effect on agenda setting. But the two areas that we don't talk about, which are purposely kept in the dark and that I explored in my book, is something that we used to do traditionally, that we do less of because of the fewer correspondents that we have, also because of some changes in our laws, but that these other nations, China and Russia in particular, do to a much greater degree. And that is, one, we use our news organizations as diplomatic outposts, and I can go into that if anybody is interested. And secondarily, and probably most importantly, they use these organizations as intelligence gathering operations. So effectively, and then again, we can go through the system of how we've done it in the past, how it is currently being done by these organizations. One of the more disturbing aspects of it in the intelligence gathering side is that we have a lot of underemployed or unemployed journalists who are now working for these organizations, for CGTN, for example, bringing their massive Rolodexes and their attitude of adversarial journalism to the powers that be, which is fine, but it doesn't carry over into the international sphere. So while we can be, if it's in the United States, for example, if you have journalists who are being critical of our leadership or our system, you don't see the same standards being applied, for example, to Xinjiang and some of the things that are happening with a genocide in another country. So I'm going to wrap it up there and say, if you are interested in more of this, we can talk about it, but I want to make sure others have a chance. And one more thing, I did do some work for Deutsche Welle as well, way back when, during the Cold War.
Kate.
Now I'm self-conscious about the microphone too. Thanks, that was fascinating. And I think one point that it really brought up for me was you talk about the fact that the business model for media in the West has been destroyed. Outside of the West, I'm not sure there ever really was a business model for independent media, which is why Deutsche Welle exists, which is why we exist as an organization. You know, there wasn't ever this model of true advertising-supported media, which whether advertising-supported media is the way we should support our media in the first place, I think is an open question that I'd hope to hear more on. So yeah, we exist to kind of the way our CEO says it is export the First Amendment. So, you know, provide this essential component of free, open, democratic societies, which is the free press in all of these countries all over the world. I don't want to get into it too much because I'm presenting this afternoon on kind of our vision. But I absolutely agree with you that the investment that our adversaries are making all over the world should scare us. It should scare us as consumers of news and information in this country who are not getting the international perspectives that we might once have from our media consumption, but it should scare us in terms of our foreign policy as well, that they are making these enormous investments in influencing foreign publics, and they have very different objectives than we do. Like we genuinely do want to see these. I'm a total optimist. We, as you know, American public media, really do want to see these free, open, democratic societies that can be our allies, that can be, you know, good partners for the United States in the future. That's absolutely not why our adversaries are investing in media.
And could I go to Dmitry now?
Can you hear me very well, first of all?
Just fine.
That's great. First of all, good morning to everybody. I'm representing Deutsche Welle, and Markos, what you said was very important to me, since I belong to the generation whose parents and myself as a child were listening to those programs that you were mentioning out of Sweden. And it's funny that we are now, it's 30, 40 years later, and we're still kind of there. And obviously, GW, just as RFRL or Voice of America or whoever else, is trying to further the democratic values outside, and the fact that the business model, if there was one indeed, really doesn't exist anymore for any free media in those markets that we are talking about. And I'm right now talking about Eastern Europe. I'm talking about the former USSR countries, but also places like Turkey and a lot of other neighboring countries, places even like Israel. The fact that we are there and we need to go there is actually showing that the local media, for various different reasons, one of those being the financial reason, cannot do those types of reporting, or not entirely do those types of reporting out of their own markets. So that they kind of need this support to just be a free, democratic media house in this way. And as somebody who has built a lot of networks, basically partnership networks, in Ukraine and Russia, when it was possible, still now doing this in Turkey and other places, you kind of see that there is a huge need for this type of partnership, collaboration, whatever you call it, in those markets. And the very important thing, RT has already been mentioned in it, I think it would be way too easy to say everything that there is to blame for. It's Russians and the Chinese. But indeed, one of the strongholds, if you want, of what RT, for example, is doing is offering a lot of information and a lot of write free information, visual content, videos, whatever you want, for free for an enormous amount of different media houses who have their very hard times financially right now. So if we aren't there, and by we, I mean the general Western democratic free media, then somebody else is there already, and everybody knows that. And you can imagine how often I hear this: we would love to take this from you if you had it, but if you don't, we know where to get it. And it's most of the time, it's Sputnik, it's Russia Today's outside outlet, it's RT itself, it's Rappli, it's the Chinese media. And that's kind of the environment where we are again right now. And there was a short time, I would say, 10, 15 years, beginning of the 90s, middle of the 90s, till 2005 to 2010 maybe, where this was kind of different, but now we are back to where we began.
Thank you very much. Sewell, how do you come at this?
Yeah, so I'm an American journalist, of course, working at an American domestic news outlet. Why am I here? I would really kind of add to the argument, to the discussion in a couple of ways. I would argue that Western democracies cannot export or promulgate the values of a free press if we don't have strong, independent free press here at home. And I've worked for global news sources. I was based in Europe covering the migration crisis for the New York Times. I'm here in Texas really for at least two reasons. One is that the Texas Tribune is really, part of the vanguard of new nonprofit news organizations that are trying to essentially revive or preserve or maintain state and local news coverage, which is the tier of news coverage in the United States that has most significantly eroded. And I would argue state and local journalism is the foundation of our journalism, because if we're not covering school boards, state houses, county councils, county commissioners, water and taxing districts, and all these areas have gone far less covered because of the economic and technological changes of the last 20, 25 years. If these levels are not being covered, then actually the whole foundation of the American journalistic enterprise is kind of threatened. So in brief, the Texas Tribune is neither advertising nor subscription-based. So for the first time, I'm working at a C3, obviously governed by an independent, nonpartisan or bipartisan, self-perpetuating board of volunteers, including high-level officials who've served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, as well as political independents. We are basically, our funding is about half from philanthropic sources, either foundations, endowments, or major gifts, et cetera. About a quarter from corporate sponsorships, and a quarter from events and membership. So it's a very diversified funding model. We don't have a paywall. We believe deeply that the 30 million people of Texas urgently need access to high quality, independent news and information. We don't publish opinion. I think that's very, very important in a state as polarized as ours. We're not trying to tell people what to think, but we do a lot of investigative and accountability reporting, and we're always trying to hold power to account. So I would say the threats to the American press first are the economic and technological, but then I'm going to add just one more, if I may, for now, which is that it's going to be hard for us as the American as the United States to export the First Amendment, which I totally love the way you put it, the way Amanda Bennett has put it, that USAGM. It's going to be hard for that if we don't have consensus on the values of a free press here at home. And there I would point to, again, these are nonpartisan observations, but I would point to freedom of information laws increasingly being harder. Governments everywhere are becoming less responsive to public records requests, open government. Obviously it does not help when we've had a president who has called the press an enemy of the people. But it's not limited just to him, I want to be clear. But we do see increasingly politicians, including of both parties, though I think it's probably more pronounced on the right, trying to bypass the media entirely. Now, of course, every politician everywhere, including FDR, has sought to go directly to the people. So, that's their prerogative. But I also think that respect for the institutional role of the press in life in America and in public life is crucially important. And then the final thing I'd point to is it doesn't help when the owner of Twitter has labeled NPR government-supported media. And I just really want to stand up for NPR right now. NPR gets less than 5% of its revenue from governmental sources. Tesla and Uber apparently have received billions and billions of dollars in federal subsidies. So the kind of reductionist impulse to basically put the same label on NPR as we would, or VOA, I don't know what's going on there, as we would Russia Today or China Daily, or Xinhua, to me is really absurd. By the way, I'm not a huge fan of labeling in general. But if we're going to do labeling, we need to understand exactly that which we're labeling and what are the criteria. And I just think it's deeply ignorant and destructive to describe our public broadcasters here in the US, which are editorially independent and are independently governed, to lump them in with, say, RT.
Well said. Can we stay with you, Sewell? Do you feel that your Texas Tribune model is exportable? Is this something that the U.S. could build in another, or could help build in another place? Because I know that you work with other. There's also the one in San Francisco, the Bay. Was it called Bay?
Bay Area. There's Oakland side, Berkeley side. Yeah. There's a lot of nonprofit, and Cal Matters in Sacramento.
That's right. Are you able? Do you think that as you're not the this is something that is working in other places in the U.S. as well? Does that mean that it's a model that could be inculcated or encouraged somewhere else?
Yeah, really great question. Two observations. First of all, this is still not embryonic, but it's still a nascent or developing field within the U.S. There are probably hundreds of local newsrooms now. Institute for Nonprofit News is the organization, association of U.S. nonprofit newsrooms. The good news is there are probably several hundred nonprofit newsrooms now. Of course, the best known ones are ProPublica, the Marshall Project for Criminal Justice, Inside Climate News, so subject-specific newsrooms, and then place-based newsrooms like ours, and Wisconsin Watch, and Mississippi Today, Flatwater Free Press in Nebraska, all good news. The field, though, is still relatively modest. It's probably a couple hundred millions of dollars a year philanthropically altogether. And so there's a lot of discussion, MacArthur, Ford, Knight Foundation, major American foundations that support journalism about how to build on this infrastructure. Because I would argue that we have to have it very, very robustly at home before we could export it. I also would point to the fact, I'm not an expert on comparative media development, but certainly we have the advantage of having a pretty deep and broad civil society still in the US. And obviously, partly because we don't have as robust a state system, we do have a strong, nonprofit and philanthropic. So again, what applies here may not be as easily applicable to, say, a middle-income country that, But the second thing I would say is, I have been quite struck, actually, Nick, by I thought moving to Texas, covering state government, I'd be, really entirely U.S. focused. I've been struck. We've met since I've only been here a year and a half, but I've already, we've had meetings with journalists from Belarus, journalists from, I'm trying to think, a German journalist, certainly, Finnish journalists recently, but the Belarus ones really stuck into my mind. They were here for a conference of some other kind. A lot of people come through Austin, which is great because they'll pop by and visit. But these Belarusian journalists, they were working for, I can't forget this, from Poland. They were working from Ukraine. They were working from Vilnius, Lithuania. There was one working from Germany. And these were journalists covering their home country from places of exile. And I thought, man, if they have the courage to do this as independent media covering their country, that's an inspiration to us. So one thing I am heartened by, I'm not sure whether, the foundation-supported model can be easily brought to other countries, but I do think that there's an increasing alliance among independent, nonprofit, public interest journalists worldwide. Many of them will be in Perugia, Italy later this month for the International Journalism Festival. And I think increasingly as journalists face threats, including in democracies, Mexico, Philippines, Turkey, you could argue that they're democracies with illiberal tendencies, but Venezuela certainly, no longer democratic, but increasingly journalists in democracies are recognizing the mutual challenges we face. And we're starting to organize among ourselves and even do cross-border investigative journalism.
Yes.
Like International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And that, to my mind, is very heartening.
Yeah, no, and one of the wonderful organizations in Europe is Bern, the Balkan investigative reporting network, which has been supported by development agencies. Sweden has been very
OCCRP.
That's right, and I know a number of reporters in that network who are just inspiring people who are doing exactly the hardest kind of work to pay for, and also the most dangerous kind of work, and speaking truth to power in the greatest tradition of the most inspiring journalists in the history of the profession. It's amazing people to know. Could I go to Dmitry, because I want, Dmitry, if I could draw you out. Sewell was talking about the problem we have here with labeling and labeling of NPR as being government paid for. And Deutsche Welle, to the casual eye, has a connection to the German government. But, so maybe you could talk about how erroneous it is to link Deutsche Welle to the German government, how it's connected to the German people, and why this was such an important part of the creation of Deutsche Welle following World War II.
Yes, I will be trying to put it in very simple terms because it's a very, very complex matter. So if you look at our structure, DW is what is in Germany called öffentlich-rechtlich, which is publicly owned organization. Now, in Germany, we have huge media houses like ARD and ZDF. Maybe some of the colleagues here know of them or know them, who are paid by direct license fees, which every household in Germany is paying. And this is, at the moment, around about $70 per quarter year. So if you count it all together, it's between 250 and 280, depending on the exchange rate, dollars a year that every household is paying basically for the for the national German broadcasters that are publicly owned. In case of DW, however, we are not part of this being paid directly by the society, but our budget comes from a Ministry of Culture and Media. If you look at this, you could say, yeah, DW is a state-owned organization. However, we are, in the true sense, a public media house because we are controlled and basically governed by a governing body, which consists of, at the moment, I think 17 members, of whom only 6 represent political parties and political organizations. The rest comes from the churches, from trade unions, from German Olympic Sports Committee, and so on and so forth. And they are overseeing, this board is overseeing what DW is doing, and this board is also basically hiring and firing the Director General of DW. Everything that comes after this, the editorial policy, the decision which languages to close and to start, what to do where, is done completely inside DW. And also, it's a very important fact, and I think that that's the one that makes it easy for me, because I get this question a lot in all of those markets which we're talking about right now. The state cannot hire or fire anybody at DW. Not the chancellor, not the Bundespräsident of Germany, not anybody. It's done by this committee, which needs to do it with, I think, 2/3 of the votes, which has in fact never happened before. And yes, of course, this system, this German public broadcasting system, is in a way a reaction to the Second World War, and it was started like this way later. If you think 25 to 30 years have passed before Germany has got its own German TV programming and TV channels again. It was the ARD, and then the ZDF came later. And in 1989, so 44 years after the end of the Second World War, there was the first private-owned TV channel that got a license for being present in Germany again. So this is the part of our story and history. And therefore, of course, we have a hugely complex also, but a big system of counterbalancing every possible involvement of any state actors in our editorial policy. It's surely it applies to DW, but it also applies to every other public media house in Germany. One interesting thing, though, since we were also talking about Sweden, for example, I know from colleagues from Sweden that who have a new government with, we'll see what the tendencies exactly are, but the tendencies seem to be less democratic than the government before, let's call it this. They say that actually nobody has ever thought about this possibility in Sweden, and therefore the Swedish public broadcasting system, for comparison, for example, is much less protected from direct government intrusion into what they are doing than the German system is. Maybe German system in this case is a bit of like an example of only one or two systems in the world of this kind, just because of Germany's history.
Thank you. Could I bring Kate in on this subject?
Sure. So we, Deutsche Welle is part of a group with us and a number of other broadcasters from democratic countries, essentially, that we call the DG8. And we have meetings every year where the leaders of those organizations get together and talk about things. And this structure and funding and independence question was one of the big topics the last time around. And we can all go on for hours and hours and hours about the merits of, a direct tax versus funding from the budget versus a license fee and the structures you build around that, boards and governance and who can hire who and who can fire who. And it's all really important. And, we have legal independence from the government. We protect that very, very staunchly. My colleagues make fun of me for how much I mention the firewall and the ways in which I am not allowed to interfere in their journalism. But I do want to say that all of that only matters to the extent that the people in charge abide by the norms, abide by the rules. I think if we've learned anything in the last few years in this country and in any number of other countries, you have to fight for these things. It's not a given. No set of rules, no board, no organizational structure, no laws are going to protect the independence of journalism if there's determined people in charge who want to attack it. So I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind, that as much as we want to set up those structures, we have this firewall internally. I communicate with the State Department, which means that I can't tell my colleagues what to do because I'm not a journalist. We have these conversations all the time about, these are the conversations we can and can't have with you. We are meant to be broadly responsive to the needs of U.S. foreign policy, but that just means we spend a lot of money on Russian, right? Because Russia is a priority for the U.S. It doesn't mean that the U.S. government can tell us what to cover. But all of us as employees of these public service media outlets, I think, have to keep in mind that we're the protection, more than any law, more than any rule. It's people in charge and people in these positions who are willing to fight for their independence.
I want to go now to Markos, because and get your take on one of the dynamics I think you can see with RT. And that is that it seems to me that if you look at the programming on RT, it has somehow become a surrogate for American alternate media. And there are people who broadcast on RT who might, thinking of Chris Hedges, for example. Chris Hedges was a doyen of all kinds of domestic news outlets within the U.S. And so, part of failures within American media have actually created opportunities for Russian media. And how do we push back against that?
So oops, there we go. So thank you. It's not just him; it's also Larry King. If you recall, he was on. I mean, you would turn on the television and you would say, "Well, am I watching CNN or am I watching RT? And of course, the types of content that was being generated was much more favorable towards the Russian perspective, even though he was a very familiar and accepted personage in American households. And so it was confusing, and it was a result of this vacuum that was being created, and this opportunity that that RT in specific was taking advantage of. And there are plenty of others in the CGTN world as well. And it's not just in the United States, it's in developing countries. I'm really concerned about how it's happening in the global south, where, for example, CGTN, back then CCTV, had hired some of the most prominent television broadcasters, for example, in Kenya, where they're located in Nairobi. And so suddenly you've been able to transfer whatever sort of brand equity and credibility that those individuals had by just buying them, essentially paying them 20% more than they were getting in their local broadcast media. So you've identified the problem. It's much broader than just that which we're facing. It's really something you'll see in some of these developing countries, which are more vulnerable to information attacks. And so the question is, how do you, well, you need a robust domestic, first and foremost. I think Sewell hit the nail on the head. You need a much more robust, healthy, viable, credible domestic news operations that can actually bolster domestic democratic values, provide for a healthy body politic, and really perform the role that they've needed to do. That's first, right? Without that, you see the types of opportunities that exist to play off of our divisions, to exacerbate and amplify those problems which are inherent within our society, within our diverse, open, loud, chaotic to the outside world society, and which do not necessarily appear appealing if you're outside of this country, especially during a time of war when those things are even being much more, which are being amplified and highlighted to a much greater degree. So that's the first. The second is, how do we deal with the international foreign policy part of it? Because for the most part, you and I don't really affect foreign policy. Well, maybe some of us in this room. But for the most part, American citizenry has no access or influence on the way foreign policy is decided, other than every 4 years deciding whether you're going to choose one president or another. It is an elite decision-making function. And how that elite is informed depends not merely on its own intelligence operations and its own sort of diplomatic outposts where you're getting information from ambassadors and their entire structure, but it depends to a great degree on what's being read in Langley and other cities. And I can tell you, a lot of that information comes from newspapers. It is no secret that it is newspapers and radio that, in fact, inform both embassies overseas, but also those who are doing the analysis here at home. When that information flow is infected or affected in ways that are challenging perhaps the perspective that supports democratic norms, then you're going to infect and affect the way that our policies are performed.
Now, I'm not sure who wants to jump in on this. Maybe it's a Sewell question or a Markos question, but part of what China's doing now is exporting journalist education, or importing large numbers of students from the developing world to study journalism in China with really quite nice tuition deals, and just on the understanding that they will write nicely about China when they go home. So that is obviously they're playing a long game. What should American journalist education be doing to respond to that? Can we match it? Should we match it, or should we trust that a journalist from Kenya studying 3 years at Beijing Communications University might develop a complicated relationship with with China.
I can offer.
Can I give an anecdote, and then I'd like to go to Sewell. So when I covered I was working for Newsweek, and I covered the revolutions of Eastern Europe, and eventually worked in Czechoslovakia and based in Prague. And I went with a colleague of mine who was working for the Dallas Morning News, in fact, and we were in Prague, and we decided we were going to go help at Charles University to start helping to teach journalism course. He and I had both gone to Columbia Journalism, and so we figured we'll bring our lessons and our experience to this new student body. So we went to the class, and we thought, well, we'll start with an investigative journalism class, and we'll start teaching sort of the tools and trade of this. First, the name of the school was the School for Propaganda and Information. So we had to kind of get over that. And secondly, we had to say, okay, when we finished all of our instruction on how do you go after public records, how do you confront public officials, at the end of the class, and nobody had questions because you didn't sort of ask anything, is the way it worked. But at the end of the class, one of the students sheepishly came up and said, you're saying you can just ask government officials anything you want? So how do you get over that hurdle? Because a lot of the training that you're going to pick up in Beijing is how do you promote, propagate the party line, the government orientation, not how do you question or challenge those powerful bodies.
Sewell?
Just really briefly, I think already there are some great American journalism schools that have significant international enrollment. Obviously Columbia University, but also City University of New York, which is doing a lot of great stuff. It's really a fully public university. You know, the tuition is much more affordable. A lot of international journalists coming through. That's true at UC Berkeley. That's true at the Missouri School of Journalism, one of the oldest and most respected schools of journalism in the United States. Obviously, you know, the whole field of American journalism education is going to be smaller than it is, it sounds like in China, where there's obviously a lot more state-backed media development. It's an interesting question. I mean, to my mind, I think what American journalism education or UK journalism education and in the other major Western democracies can do well is teach journalistic values. Because, ultimately, I think the blessing we have as American journalists is, that we have a robust enough media that we can have a skeptical, if not even fully adversarial or confrontational model with respect to power. I also think, though, that American journalism is having a lot of internal discussions right now. Mm-hmm. If all we're doing is, constantly talking about government's failures, are we giving the full picture? And so you have things like in the United States, like the Solutions Journalism Network, which is saying that journalism also has a role in looking at public policies that work. Not all of them are from the government, of course. They can be from the philanthropic sector, even the private sector. But looking at things that help restore a sense of democratic agency in America, right? Because that's a big part of what journalism needs to do too. And so I'm kind of involved in these discussions that, yes, part of our of course, a key part of our responsibility is to diagnose what ails America, what ails, American communities. But we also need to do more as American journalists, I would argue, to talk about what is working and to bolster the confidence that Americans can have. This goes without saying, but Americans never realize how much we have in common until we actually go abroad in any form.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
And then we're like, well, actually, okay, we may disagree about fundamental issues, but we actually share certain characteristics, as you say, Markos. We're fractious, we're boisterous, we have strong points of view, not always great at studying history, a strong sense of individualism. There actually are these things in common, and what can we as the American press do to kind of foster that discussion internally, while also contributing to a global set of journalism norms around independence?
As a historian,
can I just follow up on?
Could I just say, as a historian, what I've found is that the U.S. is much more attractive when it's honest about its problems, and what Americans often don't understand is that the world is not in love with a perfect America. The world appreciates an America that is honest about its problems. Superman would be unbearable were it not for kryptonite. And when the United States is honest and says we are a work in progress, and these are some of the mechanisms we use, it is presenting itself in a completely different way. And one of my colleague Vasily Ratov did some work on journalist development in Russia in the 1990s. And that is a cautionary tale, because he found that the people now working at RT who are the most hostile to the United States were trained at NBC and CNN and were overpromised to. So part of the anger and bitterness that they have towards the United States comes not from ignorance of the United States, but from a personal experience of the United States that was presented as the perfect thing, the over-promising, solving all your problems, the sort of lifelong connection to an American network that they couldn't really deliver at all. And that mispresentation of American business power, cultural power, political power can be part of the problem. Anyway, so Markos, excuse me.
No, that was actually a great. Thank you for adding that. I thought that was really great, Nick, because what you found oftentimes overseas in these countries is that. They did not believe their own news organizations, so that what the expectations were a little bit skewed, because once they got here, it wasn't as bad as they thought, but at the same time, it wasn't as idealized as they had created in their own minds. But I wanted to just reinforce Sewell's point, which is that really thin line between skepticism and cynicism. And I think that it's one that we always will have to ride. And the second point that I want to reinforce is the importance of solutions journalism. It's something that I've practiced. The Washington Monthly, which I took over with a colleague who's still the editor-in-chief, Paul Glastris, I turned it into a 501c3 exactly for these reasons, both to make it survive, but also to free ourselves from the pressures of advertising-based journalism. Look at the magazine if you haven't, but there are plenty of other examples around of solutions journalism, and it's really key to staying on the skeptical side of that line rather than the cynical side.
I'd like now to take some questions from the audience, and if we could start off with Jeff Trimble.
And this is on the issue of journalism training to America's great institutions. This is, I think, an underappreciated element of the international broadcasters. That includes U.S. international broadcasting, which includes, as a kind of a sweetener, if you will, for partnerships with foreign media outlets that, hey, we'll throw in some training for your journalists. And by the way, these are going to be people of your culture who speak your language, who can sit with you for a couple of weeks and talk about investigative reporting, not necessarily how it's done in the United States, but how you might be able to do it in Georgia. So it is, I think, an underappreciated aspect. And Deutsche Welle, I'm looking at Dmitry now, has the fabulous DW Academy, which is all about. And I wish U.S. International Broadcasting had that kind of funding to do the kind of work DW Academy does around the world overseas. And I see Dmitry has his hand up right now to tell me I probably said something wrong. Dmitry, go ahead. Thank you.
Dear Jeff, everything was wrong. I will correct everything that you have just said. No, I actually had my hand up to say exactly this. DW has the DW Academy, as it is called, and we are offering a lot of courses both in Germany and outside of Germany, trainings, and many programs for media in the countries, which is basically all over the world. However, I have to say two things. One is, so in my experience, actually, the best combination is when there is somebody coming from the West, basically from Germany, be it Georgia, be it Africa, be it wherever, and this paired with somebody who is coming from the country itself. Because as we were saying, the trust in the media in those markets is getting lower and lower. So in fact, when somebody from Germany comes to you and tells you how we do things, that's what they expect from DW in this case. They don't really want to hear the one or two experts that are internationally acclaimed from this country to tell them again how to do this for this market. They want to actually be trained with or by somebody who comes from this ideal place. And the second thing, and that's where I wanted to say thank you very much to Nick, is the idealistic view of what is happening in the West and in the media. And then, of course, the disappointment if people have their personal experience with this and it's not as rosy as it as it may look from outside. And I think being honest about having maybe a system that is also a work in progress, maybe just functioning better or way better on certain issues and values is very important. And also I want to, because we were talking about anecdotes and journalists or students who want to become journalists. 3 or 4 years ago, I had my, because we work a lot with the universities in Russia and in Ukraine, I had my talks with different university professors in both countries, and they all said that the preset that the young people come into the universities is actually that a journalist is somebody who is professionally writing something that is being set by the owner of their media. That is the picture that 99% of their students have when they come into the university. So that to them is journalism. And they say that if they are honest, maybe in 30 to 40% of the cases, they can change that after the 5 or 6 years of education. And all the programs that DW, whoever has, can only change this so much. And that's why I think the other very important thing that we all have to do, I think it's our duty as free media to do it, we're also being paid money for that, is the media literacy itself, and just doubling down on the point that it's very important to just tell how media works. And it's not all ideal. And still, what is the difference between being a journalist, propagandist, an activist? It's a very important journalistic difference, I think, to make.
Can I just add to an answer? I used to be chairman of an organization called Internews, and we do an awful lot of training around the world. There's IREX, and then, of course, Internews would also bring foreign training foreign journalists at Western Kentucky University, and so there's a robust approach towards doing that. It's in the nonprofit world. It's supported by the USG.
It's much less coherent in the United States, though, than it is in Germany. I think the Deutsche Welle Academy model is incredibly impressive. BBC Media Action is similarly impressive. And there's pros and cons of that. There's kind of the let every flower bloom American model of like throwing a little bit of money at a lot of organizations. But I think that it can be a little scattered. It can be a little one-off. You come in, you train people for 3 days, and then you go away. How much of a difference did you really make in their lives? So I think different models, but some advantages to both.
Is there a question at the back?
Question. Thanks so much for doing the panel today. I had a question about what it means to have a free press. I mean, I was raised to believe that the press should be objective and always present all sides of every issue. I guess that's kind of maybe a platitude. I'm wondering, in this time when you have an increasing presence of partisan media, whether it be media like Fox News or media enlisted on behalf of a country like RT in the case of Russia, is the so-called Western free press in danger of becoming like the enemy it's trying to fight? Is it dangerous to move away from so-called objective journalism by weighing in and saying that this type of media is undemocratic or this type of media represents a bad country like China or Russia? And does that make the fight for press freedom ultimately a partisan fight on behalf of Western and American interests?
Great question. Can we go to Sewell, please?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I think it's imperative that we avoid a domestic partisan framework on the values of a free press. And let me just go a level deeper. I think that there are critiques of American journalistic practice that have come essentially from kind of the conservative and progressive ends in America. From the conservative end, there's the observation that American journalists, especially those based in DC or New York, have tended to, more and more be trained at elite programs, be university educated, have a secular, cosmopolitan, and often very urban approach that may not, always capture the complexity and richness of America, especially the many Americans who live in the middle of the country, who live even maybe people of faith, et cetera. I think those are very, very valid. People from veterans backgrounds, which we're doing work on at the Texas Tribune. From the progressive side, you also see critiques that American journalism has often not lived up to its values. We did not cover communities of color or disadvantaged communities with the rigor and empathy and, frankly, the representation that we needed to. I think both sets of critiques actually are valid. What I would also urge, especially from a global perspective, is let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, but you raise a really interesting point, though, because the ideal of an American nonpartisan professional journalistic practice is only about a century old. It comes out of the progressive era. It comes out of thinkers like Walter Lippmann and his debates with John Dewey about the responsibilities of the press in responding to an increasingly complex industrialized world. If you look at the U.S. press in the late 18th and throughout the 19th centuries, there was yellow press, penny press, and there was press that would be actually very, very familiar to people in emerging democracies now, or frankly, were highly partisan, highly gossipy, publishing scurrilous allegations about the sex lives and out of wedlock kids of the politicians. And so, there's a bigger question in journalism history about whether the increasing partisanship or fragmentation that is occurring in some parts of the U.S. press today is actually a reversion to a much older historical norm. Now, I'll let the scholars weigh in on that, like you, Nick. But my personal observation is look, I don't try not to think of false binaries. There's always possibilities of space and movement, and I deeply believe that in the U.S. journalism is a democratic practice, that we can't be morally neutral on things like democracy, press freedom, and human rights as American journalists. But I also recognize that journalists like my dear friend and hero, Maria Ressa, do practice journalism in spaces that are increasingly authoritarian or populist or strongman dominated. And that, there are people, I'm sure, even within RT and Xinhua, who are trying within the spaces they inhabit to try to do what they can. So I try not to view the world as kind of false binaries, right? There are also frankly, journalists in the U.S. who do, I'm not going to name any names, but probably do a little bit more of a propagandizing role. I think the beauty of the American press is we're not a licensed profession. Jen Psaki, former White House communications director under Biden, can call herself a journalist. So can Tucker Carlson. I'm not going to be here to say that who's not or who is a journalist. That's not my role. My role, however, is to defend the practice of fact-based, nonpartisan, independent journalism. And I think that maintaining that core is kind of what we as American journalists need to do. Does that make sense?
I think that's very helpful. I mean,
I think that deserves applause, personally. I don't
know about that, but thank you.
I want to go to Andreas.
Just a quick note of the money that's slushing around, especially electronic media, to hire people away and so on. What's intriguing to me about that is that they don't have the permanence necessarily of the institutions that the people are being hired away from. So I was acting as the BBC bureau chief in Nairobi when, in fact, CCTV hired away a big chunk of the staff. And moreover, actually, one of the candidates running for president, Uhuru Kenyatta, at the time, he hired away the other half of the staff for something called K24, which had been started up 24 hours a day, basically pushing his campaign stuff. They were, in fact, one floor above us in the bureau. And a few months after he was elected, they shed half of their staff, and the people came back wanting their jobs back. And the same with CCTV. Many of the people who left were actually unhappy, and CCTV began to shrink its presence. And now we have Iran International, and they just started up with lots of, shall we say, money from a very large country who now is warming up, and it was started essentially as something, part of an arm of that country's foreign policy, and now that country's anti-Iran policy, and now they're warming their relations, reestablishing diplomatic ties, and it's not clear where that's going to go. So it's just intriguing to me. I mean, the money is sloshing around, but then it can suddenly also be taken away. So it used to be that you went from, you had a career, you went from BBC to VOA to RFE and back and forth and so on. And now there are these other institutions hiring and competing in terms of salaries, but then they also go away when their need has been met.
we need to wrap things up. Am I okay just to go to the panel for a final comment from everyone? Is that so? Maybe wrap up comments. Can we start with Dmitry?
Yes, I think it's very important that we are talking about the role of the US in the international public debate, basically, and free media and democratic media debate. Because whether we want it or not, everybody is looking at what the US is doing in the West, basically, and also when we are representing our values in the countries we are talking about. It's also everybody's asking, so how are you different from what US are doing? Are you working together with the US? And I think it's my mantra, basically, but I'm saying it every time. The United States presence in the world needs to be felt, I think, more than it is right now. And because otherwise, basically, there's got to be somebody else who will fill the void.
Right, absolutely. Well said. Kate.
I wanted to come back to your point about the U.S. being a little bit more humble in the way that we present ourselves to the world, because I think that's a really important lesson we've learned from the ways that we interact with our audience, that people are really surprised in a pleasant way that we report negative news about the United States, and how important that is for our credibility, and how difficult it often is to explain to our stakeholders that, like, yes, we are going to cover gun violence in the United States. We're going to cover it because it's a story, but we're also going to cover it because we need to explain how a free society resolves its problems or doesn't, and how these discussions happen, and model the democratic process in that way, even if it doesn't make us look good in the short term.
Very good point. Markos.
Strengthened and sustainable democracy depends on strengthened and sustainable journalism. It is the end all. And so that's how I would conclude, except for I would also say visit California, and you're all welcome at any time. It is the model of modern democracy.
Sewell.
Well, hard to beat that, but I would just say a couple things. I mean, I don't want to end on a negative note, but I do think the American press faces a lot of challenges. And increasingly, I think about journalistic values that need to be preserved irrespective of organizational structure, business and economic model, and kind of location or scale. Like, American journalists are facing a lot of pressures right now. Again, freedom of information, lack of access to public meetings, press who increasingly completely bypass journalists. Ron DeSantis does not engage with mainstream press in the state of Florida. And increasingly, there are several officials here in Texas who take the same position. And I think that's a mistake. I think engage with us, even if you're critical. I mean, I never minded, I did mind when President Trump called the press the enemy of the American people. I did not mind necessarily when he engaged in rigorous exchanges, because I think that actually supports democratic pluralism and values the democratic debate. And so, I'm mindful of the technological and economic challenges, but I also just feel so grateful to be an American journalist. I was a judge yesterday in New York for the Livingston Awards for Young Journalists, which are basically the Pulitzer Prizes, but for journalists under the age of 35 in the United States. And when I look at the range of states, red states and blue states, conservative and liberal, rural and urban issues, but really the through line was an ability to look critically, dispassionately, and rigorously at the challenges our society faces. I feel so honored to be part of the American press. And really, Dmitry, your words are, I feel very, very humbled, because I actually am very, very admiring of the model in Germany of strong public broadcasters, especially at the regional level, because I know that your states in Germany obviously vary in levels of wealth and prosperity. There are news deserts locally emerging in parts of Europe. It's not all a rosy picture. But I really think that all of us, working for, democratic press values of press freedom and independent press, we really actually need to do a lot more work in concert. And that's why I'm so honored to be here today, on this global stage.
Well, I think we've had a wonderful panel. My final thought, bringing together everything here, you see bumper stickers in Texas that say, freedom is not free. Well, free media isn't free either, and we've had some creative ideas as to how we can deliver free media. But free media is not free, but the lack of free media is the most expensive thing we could possibly imagine. And To me, there's no more important issue we could be talking about. And it's been wonderful to share a conversation with the panel today. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your ideas. And thank you to the audience for listening and being part of this wonderful session.
Thank you, Nick, for leading such a great discussion.